The Constitutional Convention. All right, so we've looked at the Articles of Confederation and saw how they were not working out very well in solving our nation's problems. They did manage to um, sort out the Northwest Territory area and asked that it be surveyed in the land ordinance and sort of mapped out so they could sell it to people. And they had also devised a system whereby when people moved into that system, moved into those areas, that the land they had bought, that the people would have a government. And eventually, once they had 60,000 free people, that area could ask to be a state in the United States, which, by the way, is still how we bring in states today. Now, of course, simply because you ask doesn't mean that you get to become a state, but once you had 60,000 free inhabitants and wrote your own state constitution, you could at least ask to become a state. But other than that, the Articles of Confederation didn't work very well. It didn't solve many of our nation's problems. The money supply was still basically worthless. Veterans still didn't get their pay. The Indians were still attacking on the frontier. British troops were still in some of our forts. The Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans was still closed to Americans. There was just a whole host of problems that the Articles did not solve, including the backcountry uprisings by the farmers like Shays' Rebellion, in which they tried to cancel out their debt by physically taking over, in that case, the state of Massachusetts. Although that failed, the Articles of Confederation could offer no assistance to the states. So it was obvious even back then that the Articles were not working very well, and that at the very least, they should be changed to make them work better. So with that in mind, the Articles of Confederation Congress called for a meeting in 1787 to meet at Philadelphia. Of course, Philadelphia, one of the largest cities at the time. It had been, of course, during the Revolutionary War, served as one of the capital cities of America. That's where the Continental Congress had met several times, where they had proclaimed the Declaration of Independence on our independence from Britain. And so the delegates in 1787 would be meeting at that very same place, that very same State House, which is now called Independence Hall. Now, to do that, the states themselves held elections and decided to send people from their states to this meeting. So eventually 74 delegates from 12 states were elected to go. Now, Rhode Island did not send anybody to the meeting. They did not elect anyone. They believed that although other states were having their problems, Rhode Island was fine with the system the way it was. But of the 74, only 55 would attend, and not all 55 would attend on a daily basis. So there were some important Americans not at the convention. Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, was in France serving as our ambassador to France. John Adams, who had been a member of Congress and had served on the Declaration Committee, he was not in America at the time. He was in England serving as our ambassador, our representative to England. John Hancock, the man who had signed the Declaration of Independence very boldly and had been the president of the Continental Congress, he was not at the convention. He was having health issues, so he did not attend. And Sam Adams, the head of the Sons of Liberty, also did not attend, basically because he didn't want to. He believed that this new convention was going to take away some of the state's power, and he didn't appreciate it, didn't want that at all. So there were some Americans who did not attend. But some of the more famous ones were there. Ben Franklin was there. George Washington was there. The man who had become famous for outlasting the British, for winning the Revolutionary War. And then, of course, he had sort of put down a coup d'etat. He had put down that sort of a talk about trying to take over Congress or trying to get the officers to put pressure on Congress. And then he had resigned his commission without asking anything. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't ask for fortune. He didn't ask for political office. He basically just resigned and said, I'm going back to being a farmer, which he really, really enjoyed. So now George Washington was coming out of retirement to serve in this convention. He thought it was such an important convention. He realized the articles were not working, and he realized they needed to be changed. So he came out of retirement. He put his prestige and his name behind this convention, hoping that this would make for a better America. So during this convention, every state would have one vote and a simple majority rule. Of course, 7 out of the 13 states, but only 12 states actually showed up. So you basically needed a quorum. You needed at least 7 states to actually do business and have a vote at all. Now, one of the first things they did at Philadelphia State House was basically shut the doors and shut the windows. They were going to hold this meeting in secret. Not that it was a sort of a bad thing they were planning, but they realized that if everybody knew what they were doing and knew what they were saying, that the convention would probably say or do anything. So sometimes, of course, in public with your friends, you realize that they may not agree with you. So if you say something, they may laugh at you or may say something to put you down. And so sometimes we do not act. We have a different sort of personality among our friends and in public than we do when perhaps we're alone or when we're just with a couple of close friends. So very same thing here. The delegates wanted to conduct their business in private, and then they would basically publish to all of the United States what they had done. So George Washington is going to be elected sort of the chairman of this committee. He sits on a sort of a big desk in front of the Philadelphia statehood, and one of the delegates, Ben Franklin, says, I've often looked at the picture behind the president, meaning Washington, without being able to tell whether it was a rising or setting sun. Now at length I have the happiness to know that is indeed a rising, not setting sun. So this convention will be so successful that Ben Franklin, looking at that picture every day behind Washington, trying to see whether there's a rising sun or a setting sun, he realized that the sun was not setting on America. It was not setting on what Americans had done during the Revolutionary War. It was a rising sun, that America was still early in its development. It was going to rise to be a great, like, burning ball in the sky and enlighten the world, so to speak. So what comes out of this convention actually really pleases Ben Franklin. So almost everyone coming to the convention agreed on certain things. They agreed the Articles of Confederation were not working. They agreed that there should be limited government. Nobody wanted a government that was all powerful. Just a few years before, they'd been fighting against that sort of government. They'd been fighting against the British government. So nobody wanted to create that type of government. They agreed that there should be some separation of powers, that no one person or no one group should have all the power, because that would lead to something that you might have to fight again. They also agreed that we had to do something to make the money worth something, so that basically that the state should stop making their own money and there should just be a national currency. And that we certainly needed a stronger national government. How strong? That was really the question at the Constitutional Convention. So looking back at the Articles of Confederation, you basically have one branch, Congress. And there was the legislative branch. It made the national laws, but all states were equal. That is, every state got one vote, and the people that were going to the Articles of Confederation Congress were appointed by the state legislature. They weren't elected by the people of their state. They were appointed by the state legislature, and every state, no matter how many people, got one vote. And to do anything really important, you would need all 13 states agreeing. And again, people realized this would probably not work in the future, that you're going to have to do something to change this. So all at once, Virginia offers up their plan first. And it's sort of a radically different look than the Articles of Confederation. So if you sort of the Virginia plan here, the Virginia plan looked very different because it had 3 branches, not just Congress, not just someone to make the laws, but an executive branch to enforce the laws, a judicial branch, the court system, to interpret the laws for you. And in that legislative branch, in Congress, there's not just one box, you notice, there's two boxes. So they divided Congress up into two groups, one called the lower house of representatives, two called the upper house of the Senate. And basically in the Virginia plan, whoever ran the House of Representatives would appoint the upper house, and the voters of the state would elect the members of the lower house. So the state legislature is no longer going to appoint the members, but people of your state are going to vote on the members. And every state will not just now have one vote. In fact, the more people you have in your state, the more votes you will get in this House of Representatives, and the more votes you will get in the Senate. So now Congress will not be apportioned, as it says, where every state gets the equal number of votes. In the Virginia plan, the bigger population states get more votes. And consequently, the bigger population states who would run the House would also run the Senate. And because the Congress is going to appoint the judges, that means the bigger population states would basically run the judicial branch. And because the Congress was going to appoint the president, the executive branch, that would mean the bigger population states would run the presidency as well. So you can probably already guess which state was one of the biggest population states. And if you answered Virginia, you're right. Much like our plans, they always sort of favor us for some reason. So, you know, when you're thinking about going on vacation, you may come up to your parents and say, I have this great plan for a vacation. And of course, the great plan for vacation is all about what you want and about what you need and about how you think you will have fun. And of course, you always throw in something like, oh, our younger brother or sister, they'll like that part. But really, it's really about you. So the Virginia plan is really about the big population states, and Virginia was the biggest population state, with over 500,000 people of the basically 2.5 million people in America at the time. Now, to run this, the Congress was going to, you didn't have to have all 13 states agreeing anymore. Instead, you just needed half the votes plus one. Half the votes plus one. So if you're looking at how many states that would be, if you look at Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Maryland, and the number of votes that are going to get in the House, which is on the right-hand side, you'll notice that's basically 32 votes, which is those 4 states. And if you need just one more vote, that means you'll have to include New York. So basically the top 5 states will be able to outvote all the other states all the time. And the top 5 states, from Virginia all the way down to New York, they'll be running the Congress, they'll be passing laws, they'll be appointing the judges, and they'll be basically the presidents. That's where the presidents will be coming from. So this wonderful plan, the Virginia plan, you can probably guess which states favor this plan. And if you guess the top 5 states, you're right. Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Maryland, and New York all like this plan really a lot because, hey, we're going to rule. You can also probably guess which states did not like this plan. If you guessed all the rest of them, you're right. So the major problem was the big states would be in control in the Virginia plan. So New Jersey offered up their own plan. Now, if you go back, New Jersey was one of the smaller states. Didn't have as many people as the top 5 states. So under their plan, this is basically how it's going to work. You're going to have one box for Congress. It's just like the Articles of Confederation in that regard. You will have a president, an executive branch to enforce the law, maybe more than one president, and you'll have a judicial branch, the court system, to interpret laws. So both these plans, Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, agree that you need more than just Congress. You're going to need someone to enforce the national laws, and you're going to need someone to interpret or tell people what the laws mean so they can obey the laws. So basically all the states agreed on that part. So under the New Jersey plans, basically every state gets one vote again. Every state gets one vote. So that basically means out of 13 states, you just need 7 votes for majority, for over 50%. So under this plan, the state legislatures would elect just like before. Under this plan, every state would get 1 vote just like before. But now under this plan, instead of having all 13 states agree, you just need a majority. You just need over half the states to agree, which would be 7 out of the 13. You can probably guess which 7 states. Yes, it's a 7 states that didn't like the Virginia plan. So now the bottom 7 states, with less than half of the population, will now be able to run Congress. And because they'll be able to run Congress, they'll be able to appoint the judges. They'll be able to appoint the president or presidents. You can already guess which sort of state New Jersey is. It's a smaller state. So again, this plan favors the state that introduced the plan. And you can probably already guess which states don't like this plan. If you guess the top 5 states, Virginia through New York, you're right, they didn't like the plan. Because now they would not be able to rule. Now basically they're going to be bossed around. They're not going to be the judges. They're not going to be the presidents. They're not going to be able to pass laws. Just the bottom 7 states with less than half the population. So now New Jersey is saying this is an awesome plan, and Virginia and the big states are saying that's a terrible plan. Virginia says our plan, the Virginia plan, is the best plan, and New Jersey and the small states are saying that's a stupid plan. And so pretty soon there's name calling, and pretty soon all the states are saying, well, if you don't vote for my plan, we're going to go home. No, if you're not going to vote for my plan, we're going to go home first. And the convention threatens to break apart. And if it breaks apart, remember we go back to the Articles of Confederation. And how was that working? It wasn't working. So if the states go home from this convention, it's not looking good for the United States. Fortunately, between the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, and between big population states and small population states, there was another state. Wasn't quite a small state, wasn't quite a big state. It was the state of Connecticut. And Connecticut offered up a compromise. That is, neither side, neither Virginia and their friends, nor New Jersey and their friends are going to get everything of what they want, but both sides will get something of what they want. So the Connecticut plan, which is also called the Great Compromise, and it's called the Great Compromise, not because Tony the Tiger invented it, but because it kept the convention from breaking up. It saved America, in other words. So under this plan, notice, by the way, if you're looking at the boxes and things like that, what does this plan look like most? Just looking at the boxes, does it look like the New Jersey plan or Virginia plan? Well, of course, it looks like the Virginia plan, because the Virginia plan has 2 boxes. Now, if you look first at the first box, called the House, it says percentage population. That means the more people you have in your state, the more votes you're going to have. Which group is going to like this? The big population states. But notice, the voters of the state are going to elect these people. And who's going to like that? Is that more like the Virginia plan and New Jersey plan? Well, it's like the Virginia plan. So far, people in Virginia, New York, and the big population states are saying, hey, this plan looks great. This plan looks awesome. But then you move to the next box called the Senate. And in the Senate, the state legislature is going to appoint the members there, just like the New Jersey plan. And in the Senate, every state is equal. It gets the same number of votes, just like the New Jersey plan. So now New Jersey is saying, hey, that's not such a bad plan. Look at our box. It's just like our box. It's awesome. However, notice the plus sign in between. So the House has to work with the Senate to make the laws. 50% plus one of the House, plus 50% plus one of the Senate would have to vote in order to make a law. That means the big population states, they just can't make laws by themselves, and the small population states just can't make laws by themselves. So it's called the Great Compromise, and it saves the convention from breaking up. Yay. So under the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, you have a two-house legislative branch, the House of Representatives based on population elected by the people, and all taxing and spending laws would start with the House. Meanwhile, the Senate, you'll have the same number of votes, in this case, 2 votes per state, not just 1, but 2 votes per state, but every state's still equal in that regard. So Virginia, the biggest population state, still gets 2 votes, and a little tiny Rhode Island or Georgia, just 10,000, 30 or 40,000 people, will still get 2 votes. So again, the big population states like the House of Representatives, the small population states like the Senate. So they can work together. And it saves the convention from breaking up. Unfortunately, that's not the only problem. That's not the only argument. Because you have 12, at least 12 of the 13 states, each one is bringing their own problems to the table. And different regions like New England, the middle colonies, which are now the middle states, the southern colonies, which are now the southern states, each have their own particular problems that maybe some of the other states don't have. And so, for example, the next great controversy at the convention is how to count slaves for representation and taxation. So if you look at the chart here, you'll see the population, you'll see how many slaves they have, and you'll see that down in the south, you have a lot more slaves, and they're a greater percentage of the population. So, for example, North Carolina has about 400,000 total population, but 1 out of every 4 of those people are slaves. And what North Carolina and Virginia and South Carolina are thinking is that we'll count everybody in our state as a person so we can have more votes. That is, North Carolina is thinking that we'll count everyone so we have about 400,000 people, which basically means we're as big as Pennsylvania. Yay! We'll get the same number of votes as Pennsylvania. Yay! But Pennsylvania's saying, wait, no. We have just over 400,000 people. That's true, but only like 4,000 of them are slaves. So, no, you people in North Carolina shouldn't get the same number of votes as we do, because you're counting like 1 out of every 4 of your people who are slaves as people, but you don't treat them as people. So basically, Pennsylvania is saying, if you people in North Carolina want to actually count slaves as people, you need to treat them as people. And North Carolina is saying, no, we're going to treat them like slaves, but we're going to count them like people for more votes. And Pennsylvania and the other states with very few slaves said, no, that's not right. And so there's another big argument over how are you going to count slaves if you count slaves? And at this point, some of the Southerners said, hey, if we don't get our way, we're just going to go home. We're not going to treat our slaves as people. We're going to still treat them as slaves, but we should be able to count them. And many Northerners are also upset and say, well, if you're going to treat them like slaves and count them as people, that doesn't seem very fair. Maybe we should go home. And again, the convention threatens to break up. But again, there's a compromise called the 3/5 compromise. So under the 3/5 compromise, for every 5 slaves you have in your state, you can count them as 3 people. You can count them as voters, 3 voters. So that means the southern states are going to get a few more votes, but they're not going to get all the votes they want. Also, since you're counting them like people, Congress will be taxing them like people. So the 3/5 compromise is, again, that Southerners get to count some of their slaves in their total number of people, so they'll get a few more votes in the House of Representatives. Now remember, this doesn't really apply to the Senate, because in the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. It doesn't matter whether you have no slaves in your state or a lot of slaves in your state. In the Senate, every state gets 2 votes already. But in the House of Representatives, where the more people you have in your state, the more votes you get. This is a big deal for many Southern states. And so they're happy, they're getting a few more votes, and Northerners are happy, they're not getting all the votes the Southerners think they should get. So that's another compromise. Another compromise is whether Congress can make any laws about slavery or not. Of course, at this time, in 1787, when the Constitution was being written, slavery seems like it's on its way out, for 2 reasons. One is the Revolutionary War. When the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, at first that didn't include slaves, but maybe it did, because as people read the document again and again, and we won this Revolutionary War, more and more Americans are thinking, maybe this phrase does include slaves. Maybe all people should be equal, even though in the past we haven't seen them as equal. So starting immediately after the Revolutionary War, many northern states are coming up with ways to end slavery in their states. Many of them are not like canceling slavery immediately that day, because there's problems with if you count slavery immediately, most of these slaves can't read or write. How are they going to take part in government? If you basically just fire them from their jobs and they're walking around the streets, how are they going to live? They'll probably starve to death. So many northern states are thinking we need to end slavery, but over a number of years. We need to first educate the slaves so they can read and write, so they'll be equal with the rest of us when they become free people. And we need to make sure that eventually they'll have a skill, not just agricultural skill, but some other type of skill that people will hire them so they won't be starving on the street. So, but nevertheless, many in the North are in the process of basically ending slavery. And even people in the South, many people in the South are talking about ending slavery. First because of the Revolutionary War, but also because of economic reasons. Now, after the Revolutionary War, it's not making much economic sense to have a slave. Basically, you house, as a slave, you're not getting paid, but the owner of the slave has to feed the slave so they don't die. They have to house the slave. They have to have some place for them to live, and all that costs money. And so many in the South are also arguing and thinking about that slavery doesn't seem to be very economical anymore, and maybe, especially combined with those wars in the Declaration of Independence, maybe we should end it. So it seems that slavery is sort of dying off. But again, Southerners don't want to end it immediately, because that they fear might create mass confusion in the South. You'd have all of these now newly freed people without an education and many without a job. It could result in a lot of deaths, and who knows, maybe many of the former slaves are really angry and might want to kill their former masters. So it could create a lot of problems in the South. So the South doesn't want really Congress to pass any anti-slavery legislation, at least not for a long time. But of course, Northerners thinking maybe that time to pass anti-slavery legislation should be in just a few years. So they compromise. Basically, as soon as the Constitution is ratified, the clock ticks for 20 years. And at the end of 20 years, Congress will be able to make laws about slavery. They'll be able to make laws about stopping the importation of slavery, stopping the bringing in of slaves, and eventually even perhaps to forbid slavery entirely. There's also many other arguments in the Constitutional Convention. For example, because Southerners send out a lot of stuff to sell, like tobacco and rice and indigo, which are big money makers, they don't want Congress taxing stuff going out of the country. But many Northerners import a lot of stuff from overseas, and they don't want Congress putting an import tax on things coming in. So there's a lot of disagreement about what Congress could tax. Eventually, they agree again. They compromise again. And the compromise is Congress can tax things coming into the country, but they can't tax things going out of the country. And that really pleases a lot of Southerners because a lot of their crops or whatever, tobacco, rice, indigo, that they're selling overseas will not be taxed, and that really pleases a lot of Southerners and gets more Southern states on board with this new Constitution. Some of the other compromises will be, for example, what to do with the court system. If you have a national court, who's going to appoint it? At first Congress was going to appoint it, but under the Virginia plan, the big population states would basically run things, and so basically the judges would all be from New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. And under the New Jersey plan, the small population states would run things. So basically all your judges would be from, like Georgia and Delaware and Rhode Island, places like that. So again, there's a compromise, and the compromise is that the president would appoint the judges in our national court system, but only the Senate, which is at that time controlled by the small states, only the Senate would be able to okay those picks. So basically what people thought was going to happen was the president would probably be a big population state person, probably come from Virginia maybe, and he would be picking the court members, but because the Senate was controlled by the smaller population states, probably what would happen is, in order to get his nominees past the Senate, the president from the big population state like Virginia would probably have to have some small population state judges as well. It wouldn't just be all the judges. The judges wouldn't just all be from Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York. Some of them would be from the smaller states. And that's why that system was devised like the way it was. And then, of course, you have choosing the executive branch, who's going to enforce the law. And at first, under the New Jersey plan, they wanted a sort of a plural executive. They wanted presidents. They wanted a council of presidents like from 3 to 5. And basically those guys people would get together and vote on what they should do, just like Congress would get together to vote. But eventually, both sides agreed on basically one person to be president. Certainly not as powerful as the king. They didn't want a king, at all, because of what happened in the British rule. But they recognized there's, you're probably going to have one person to make a decision. And so, but then the argument becomes who's going to elect this president. If we go by popular vote, if we go by population, it's going to be the big five again. It's going to be Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, all those top 5 states. They're electing the same. So the president's always going to be from the top 5 states. But then, of course, if you elect the president simply by the state legislatures, then it's going to be by the 7 bottom states. It's going to be by the small state people. So how do you work this? So eventually they come up with a plan called the Electoral College system. So under this plan, first of all, it's based on population, but it's skewed. So what happens is, as we see on this chart, it's estimated that when the elections are held, Virginia's going to get 10 votes in the House of Representatives, which means they're going to get like 10 votes for president. But then little Delaware has so few people, they'll only have 1 vote in the House and 1 vote for president. So ordinarily, Virginia would outvote Delaware 10 to 1. But the genius of the system is they add your 2 senators. So if Virginia gets 10 House members, you add your 2 senators, that means they'll get 12 votes for president. Now, Delaware, with 1 House member, but you add your 2 senators, now has 3 votes for president. Does Virginia still outvote Delaware? Yes, but not by 10 to 1, because now it's basically 12 to 3, or basically now it's 4 to 1. Delaware is still outvoted, but not by as much. So now the small population states can rest easy. It's not just going to be the big top 5 population states always outvoting them all the time, because it looks like even the top 5 population states, you're going to need some of the small population states to vote with you in order to elect the president. So again, the whole system is designed as a compromise between the big population states and the small population states. Just like the congressional system, just like the legislative system, just like the Great Compromise was designed that way, just like the court system was designed this way. So in the Constitutional Convention, you have a lot of compromises, but many of them are between the big population states and the small population states, because no one wants to be bossed around. No one state at least wants to be the state that's being bossed around by all the other states. Everybody wants to have an equal say, or at least have a chance to have an equal say. They at least want a chance to have some input into the system. So this is why the system is designed like it was. Now, there's a lot of ways you can elect your president. You can elect them through our electoral college system, which was designed in 1787. You can have a direct popular vote where all the people in the country just get together and vote, and whoever gets the majority wins. You can have voting based on districts in your state. There's a lot of different ways. But it's important to realize people don't want to feel like they're going to be bossed around, even by a majority of the people. So one of the reasons that they disregarded the popular vote at the time was because even if you get 51% of the popular vote, does that give 51% of the people the right to boss around the other 49% of the people? And so the small population states with less than half the population said, no, that shouldn't give you the right, just simply because you have a few more people than us, shouldn't give you the right to boss us around and violate our rights. We need a system that's going to protect our rights against a majority. We need a system where people have to work together, whether they're in a big population state or a small population state. And so that's the system that was designed by the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It was a series of compromises, compromise after compromise. For example, the presidency, how many years should they serve? At that time, most people in government were elected to every year. So in most states, you had your governor elected and they served a year and then had to serve election, get reelected every year. But along with this new system, people wanted stability. They certainly wanted a democracy. They wanted a system where the people ruled, but they wanted a system that was stable. Because some of the problems with democratic governments in the past had been that they were very volatile. People change their mind, and oftentimes they change their mind often. And so, 51% of the people say we want to do this one day, and the next day 51% of the people say no, we don't want to do that anymore. It's very confusing and makes it very hard for you to have a very stable economic system or a very stable government system. And that's one reason, for example, that's why the president has a 4-year term with limited powers through checks and balances. They wanted the president to be limited. They didn't want a king, but they also wanted someone that could provide some stability so that you didn't have these volatile swings back and forth. And that's why the House of Representatives was to be elected directly by the people, but the president and Senate and the courts were to be indirectly elected. So you would have some stability. So the system that comes out of this has three branches. You have an executive branch headed by the president, whose job it is to enforce the laws. And the executive branch is headed by the electoral colleges, is elected by the electoral college, which is basically the states have a certain number of votes. Now, of course, today the states allow the people generally to vote. And generally, whoever wins the majority vote in that state, all the state's electoral votes goes to that state. However, that doesn't have to be that way. States themselves decide how to cast their votes and how to whether they allow voters to elect to allow. So every state gets a certain number of votes under the Constitution. But how the states come up with how you're going to divide that vote, or whether you can divide that vote in your state, or who's going to be the electors and who's going to go out to vote, etc. All of that's run by the states. So it can be different from state to state. Then, of course, you have the judicial branch. The judicial branch are the judges. They're the court system that interprets law, tells you what the words of the Constitution mean in real life, as we'll see as we look at each one of these branches in detail. The judicial branch is appointed, all national judges are appointed by the president, but the Senate has to okay those appointments. And then you have the Congress, the legislative branch, whose job it is to make the laws. And in Congress, you have two houses. The lower house, House of Representatives, sometimes just called the House. They're, the more votes you have, the more people you have in your states, the more votes you have in the House of Representatives. So today, Texas and California have a lot more votes than a place like Wyoming, because Texas has about 30 million people, California has about 40 million people, Wyoming has about 1 million people. So in the House of Representatives, the more people you have in your state, the more votes you get. And those people would be elected directly by the voters of their states. Now in the Senate, every state gets 2 votes. Wyoming gets 2 votes with 1 million people plus, and Texas gets 2 votes with 30 million people, and California gets 2 votes with 40 million people. Every state gets 2 votes. But the House and Senate have to work together to make the laws. So our electoral college system is designed. It was a series of compromises, started in 1787. And as we'll see, it's been, well, it was eventually ratified or okayed. It would go into effect after 9 of the 13 states agreed to it. Everyone realized that you don't want to wait for all 13 states to agree, because that would never happen, maybe. And if it did, it'd take a long time. So the Constitution went into effect when 9 of the 13 states ratified it, and that was in 1788. Notice, by the way, tiny Rhode Island, they didn't join until 2 years later. But it's a series of compromises between the different states designed to let you, the people, rule, but also to have a stability which allows for economic growth and government growth as well. And you can sort of gauge whether they did a good job or not by how long this has lasted. So the Articles of Confederation lasted 8 years. It went into effect basically in 1781, and basically in about 9 years later, 8 or 9 years later, in 1788, the new Constitution took over. So 8 or 9 years for the Articles. This new Constitution in 1787 that they wrote, still with us today, 231 years later. Now, there certainly have been some changes to the Constitution, which are called amendments. But if you don't include the first 10 amendments, which are a Bill of Rights, which really don't affect the way you govern, that's really only about 16 or so changes in over 230 years. And just think about the number of changes you've had in just a few years to your life, to you, to the type of clothes you wear, or the way you do your hair, or maybe where you live. I mean, you've had a lot of changes in just a few years. But the Constitution has really had only about 16 changes over 231 years. So it's been a very stable document, which is how the writers envisioned it or saw it. But it's also allowed the people to rule. And as we'll see over time, the word people has included more and more different groups of people. So our Constitution and the Constitutional Convention, and eventually we'll look at how that was ratified and which group supported it and why they supported it and how it became the law of the land.